teach them to learn those connections for themselves, right?
Yeah.
So that they develop that confidence and self-trust that they can make those decisions on their own. And are they going to get it perfect? No. Do we get it perfect as adults? No. But I think, that's how to try to create and teach this like healthy relationship. So that's what we do with our kids. We're just constantly, not constantly, but like any mealtime or, when we go to birthday parties, it's like, yes, my kids eat the cake and ice cream.
Right.
But you better believe that if they're complaining about a symptom or something later on,
you're going to tie it back to that.
We're going to potentially teach and make connections so that they can learn that.
All right. Well, welcome to the PHW Podcast. This is episode 2. I am extremely excited to have this conversation with Dr. Kristen Marvin. We've been good friends, we've known each other for a long time. You are a naturopathic doctor at our clinic, Prairie Health and Wellness. And I want you to talk a little bit about, for those people who don't know what a naturopathic doctor is, I'd love for you to just give me kind of a brief overview of why you decided, because if I remember, you sort of had a dividing path in your history where you sort of had to decide, were you going to go the allopathic path or were you going to go naturopathic path? Tell me why you decided to go the naturopathic path.
Well, first of all, I'm very excited to be here. I think, you and I get to have these fun conversations all the time, daily almost anyways. So it's going to be kind of fun to like get it on film. But yeah, you're right. I really did kind of have this, I came to this fork in the road of, I was on track. I was, studying to take the MCAT. I worked in a, more traditional or conventional primary care office, which was an amazing experience. I mean, I learned so much from those people, those docs, nurses, everybody that I worked with. But I also really learned along the way of how I didn't want to do things or didn't want to practice medicine, or maybe not necessarily even that, but just like this could be different. And I think a big part of that was also maybe many people are familiar with the very well-known Reardon Clinic here in Wichita. It was actually my parents who became patients there, because I grew up in the late 80s and early 90s, and we were very much a standard American family as far as food and diet goes. We had soda in the house, we ate fast food, lots of processed, it was cereal for breakfast type of thing. Right. And then my parents sought out Reardon Clinic for their own health purposes and learned a ton and had great experience. And I should say my very generous parents offered my sister and I to go have that experience there as a patient. And I was an adult when that happened. I was a young adult. I had just finished undergrad, so I think I was about 22. Yeah. And so I was a patient of a medical doctor, an MD there, Dr. Rebecca Kirby. And it was really through working with her. I mean, she was the one who was like, hey, have you ever heard of naturopathic medicine? Because of course I had kind of shared with her, like, here's kind of what my path looks like now. Yeah. And so, I, had this amazing experience and learned that there was another way to do things. And that was really the turning point for me to say, okay, it's not this form of medicine, it's naturopathic medicine that, is really what I'm after. Yeah. And so I think, if I was trying to explain it to somebody, I might even pose it as a question of like, if you're looking for a doctor who's going to help you understand your body as a whole, like understand and learn like how these complex systems work together and to support how they really work instead of just focusing on diagnosing a problem and here's a pill or a surgery or whatever, for it. It's like, it's funny. When I started, coming from the allopathic side of things, it was really my wife who encouraged me to start learning about the nutritional side of medicine. Yeah. And so I started going to conferences. One of the first conferences I went to was in Orlando, Florida. And I met a naturopath there. And, as I sat next to them during these conferences, I realized like I was really impressed with the breadth of knowledge that you all have in the biochemical and there were so many things that I think I had learned in medical school or touched on that I feel like naturopaths really spend a lot of time going through those pathways and understanding how the human body detoxifies, how we methylate, how we utilize nutrients. And
So for every conference I went to after that, I always tried to sit next to a smart naturopath because if I had questions, I could always lean over and talk to them. So it's funny. I think I've taken the path where I've really now tried to learn more of a naturopathic approach. And try to think of the human body as a whole. Yeah. Whereas you guys, that's you're just built from the ground up to do that. That's your foundational training.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So you started off how many years ago at Prairie Health and Wellness?
2014. I wasn't quite right at the beginning when you guys first opened day one, but I definitely weaseled my way in.
Yeah, if I remember right, you applied as a medical assistant. You were my medical assistant.
I had just graduated from med school, and the school that I went to where my graduation date had fallen had just passed that second round of boards for the year. So I had to wait about 5-ish maybe months at most to take my board exams. And I was like, well, what am I gonna do during this time? And you just happened to post a job listing. And I reached out and I was like, I know I'm super overqualified for this position, but please have me.
I think you might go down as the best spend that we've had in HR.
You definitely got the best bang for your buck on that one.
Yeah, definitely got the best bang for a buck. I've been, it's been a privilege to be able to practice beside you. We're getting ready to celebrate our 10th anniversary.
That's amazing.
It's crazy how fast it's gone.
It goes fast.
I think, I'm thinking back to the early days in the clinic where we were talking today in our group meeting with the providers about how we were getting back to having our lecture series and inviting people into the space where we practice and some of the things we talked extensively about food, which is what we're talking about today. Yeah. So what are the nutritional challenges that you feel like that not only our patients are facing, but people who may not even be thinking, I think the kind of patient we have coming to Prairie Health and Wellness, they're already interested in their health. They're looking for a different solution. But what are some of the nutritional challenges you see a lot of people facing today?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think there's a few. I would say like the more common ones that I see come up when I'm working with patients would just be they feel overwhelmed. There's a lot of information out there, which, I'm still going to be always mostly a fan of because I think that's, one of the best ways people can empower themselves is to seek out that information and learn. But in the same token, there's a lot out there and it's like, well, how do you know what to trust? What do you think, what's best for me? I mean, is that what's best for everybody else? So they feel overwhelmed for that reason. But I think another reason they feel overwhelmed is because of the, American kind of hustle culture that we live in. Everybody has a gazillion and one things going on. And, I think one of the bigger problems is that when we look at something as important and foundational as nutrition, I mean, we have to eat to live. Yeah. I know a lot of people live to eat, but we have to eat to live. And so if it's that important, how can we not give it the time and effort that it deserves, right? And so I think that's another huge issue for people is that they're too busy. And that often takes a back burner because we have grocery stores and, restaurants and fast food restaurants and gas stations on every corner.
Well, gas stations now practically have restaurants in them. I mean, growing up, gas stations were places where you got oil filters, an air filter, it was more of a service station. Right. And now you walk into Quick Trip and it's a full menu of food. I mean, you got the roller grill there, you've got Casey's Pizza, which everybody raves about. So I think convenience is probably driving that. Why do you think, when we talk a lot about nutrition science, why do you think we haven't, why do you think the science hasn't caught up to say, hey, this isn't the way we should be eating? Or why do we struggle so much to find good information about nutrition?
Well, technically we do have science to show that, eating these ultra high processed foods is damaging to our health. So I think the evidence is there, but I don't think, we certainly don't have our government, for one, supporting us to try to eat well. I mean, we've all heard stories and
so like the food pyramid.
Yeah.
So there are problems with the food pyramid. Yeah. That's not a scientific based document that you're saying grains shouldn't be the basis of the.
Well, I think we have to admit that there are problems in research, right? And I'm not saying that we should like chuck it all to the curb, but I think we have to be aware that, you know, there is bias. You have to know when you're looking at a study, who funded this study.
That's a great point. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a study that had come out, and it was talking about non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And in this research was actually one that a few years prior had published the paper, you know, kind of pointing out that, hey, there's these people that don't have celiac disease, they struggle with gluten still, and here's what he called it. Well, then he published almost a retraction to that paper. It made the front page of JAMA. And I remember, because that was a time when you and I were seeing a lot of patients who we recognized, you don't have the markers for celiac. We've done a colonoscopy and an EGD. We don't see microvilli being blunted. But you definitely can't handle wheat. And so when this study came out and said just the opposite of what you and I had experienced, I thought to myself, how can this be? Well, you dig into the paper and you find out, okay, here's this company that funded it. And so I remember at that time it was an Australian conglomerate. And I thought, an Australian conglomerate? Why have they funded this? And so went and looked them up. And of course, you look at their Wikipedia page and you find that, oh, they have all these like 11 subsidiaries. Well, one of the subsidiaries was the largest wheat producer in Australia. And Australia is the size of the United States. So, and that was not anywhere in the publication. They didn't start the paragraph by saying, by the way, the wheat industry has funded this paper. So I think you're right. I think the science is out there, but you need to learn to read it and say, okay, who's paying for it?
Right.
And like you said, where's the bias in this? Because that was a huge bias that wasn't revealed. And again, front page of arguably the top medical journal in the world. And it took me 10 minutes to find out that this is probably a sham.
And there's a lot of other problems too, where, again, I think probably a big part of it is, you know, driving, or like what's being driven behind is who is funding it, like what are the intentions, what are these desired outcomes sometimes. And unfortunately, there's evidence of people even changing the goalposts, even if like during the research, it's starting to show something that maybe doesn't support their hypothesis. And instead of like what good science would be to just admit that and be like, darn, that doesn't fit my hypothesis. We've got scientists moving the goalposts.
I feel like you're talking about Ansel Keys back in the 60s.
That's one. There's some more recent ones, but maybe we don't have to get into that totally. But I think, you know, that also, I think, kind of ties back even, or could even be a good segue into another problem that I think a lot of people face. And that's, you know, I think gluten or wheat is a perfect example of this, where, you know, when people go to the store to purchase a food, or even if they're just thinking about like, I'm buying this food, this is what I think it is. It's not. You know, when you read the nutrition facts label on these packages, you know, your bread, what in your mind should be, hey, this is just wheat, you know, so flour, wheat flour, salt, and water is not that. If anything, those are maybe even arguably like the smallest ingredients. And so, you know, and again, you know, we could go down rabbit holes as to why that is. You know, it's obviously people can make arguments about, you know, well, that doesn't last on the shelf as long, or, you know, but it's like that stuff is
the bread gets hard after a few days.
But that stuff is clearly coming at a cost. So I think that's a huge issue people face too, is they just think, well, I'm just buying this thing, and it's not really just this thing.
Right, like you hear patients say, well, I eat whole wheat bread. And I mean, I don't think that they even understand that it's not, you know, again, I think it's the high fructose corn syrup they're adding to the bread loaves. It's the preservatives. It's the
artificial junk.
That fortified with folic acid that our bodies can't
So I'd even
process.
question, like, do these people who have non-celiac gluten intolerance, is it really the gluten? I mean, is it really the wheat?
Think about your patients who go to Europe and they come back and go,
you hear this all the time.
Talk about what you hear people say. Because
I'm sure
I think I've heard that story from
everybody
patients
out there
many
has
times.
either experienced it themselves, or they've heard it from a friend or family member. Like, when I go to Europe, I can eat all the bread, I can eat all the pasta, you know, but when I'm home, I feel terrible, or I can't. And, you know, I mean, I think there's definitely good evidence to show that, you know, there are certain chemicals that the EU allows, and there's certain ones that they don't. I mean, I recently learned that there are several, you know, countries in the European Union who won't import certain products from our country when it comes to like, grains like wheat and such. I even learned recently that Mexico won't even import corn from our country.
Yeah, Mexico doesn't use any GMO corn.
Yeah.
They don't spray glyphosate.
I also learned, like, to be fair, there are certain chemicals that do get used, I think, in the European Union, where the United States at least like puts a stop on some of that stuff. So, it can go both ways, but I think the point is that a lot of people don't know that. They just don't know that.
So it's not only maybe the type of wheat that we're using in the U.S., it may be the chemical residuals that are on that wheat.
Yes.
It could be the additives that we're throwing in there. I mean, the way we're baking bread. I mean, you bake sourdough now.
Yeah.
And it's been really fun watching you learn how to do that. But that's a completely different way of making bread, where you're air fermenting and keeping a culture going for sometimes for years.
It's the original way of making bread.
It's the original way of making bread. Yeah. I mean, I think that is a struggle when patients go, we often talk about when you go to the grocery store, try to stay out of the aisles, stay on the edge of the grocery store where there's fresh fruit, there's the vegetables, the meat and the dairy. But even there, I mean, now we need to be educating our patients about don't buy anything with this non-nutritive coating appeal, because we just don't know what does that do to human gut. We have no idea what the ingredients are. We've been told that it's safe, but there's a lot of things that I think we've been told are safe that turn out not to be. And then I think there's also food groups that get demonized unfairly. I mean, I had a patient today who was like, well, I sometimes eat red meat. And I was like, great. Okay. Where's your meat come from? So talk about what are some of those challenges where people just have this idea that certain food groups are bad for them, and how do we help them overcome and really teach them about what food should be? What's the simplest way for someone to approach their diet if they don't know anything about what we're talking about?
Yeah. I mean, I think if I just had to throw it into like one simple sentence, it would be to just try to focus on eating just real food in its mostly natural form, right? Where it doesn't require a lot of modification or even preparation or processing, right? I certainly, one of the sometimes more common excuses I hear is like, oh, but that's just, like not exciting, to just eat like pick a piece of meat, pick a veggie, pick even a grain, right? Assuming that we're operating on those principles of like, has this been sprayed to death with chemicals or not? And, like, how was this grown? What went into it? What is all on it, right? So I think understanding that is helpful. And it can be that simple. I mean, I bet you would agree, in eating that way, you probably have had some really enjoyable meals of just focusing on that alone.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I mean, some of my favorite meals are, I've rarely opened a cookbook. It's, barbecuing some meat, grilling, adding salt and pepper. We may throw some vegetables on a tray and roast them. Right. And I have really enjoyed getting back to that simplistic way of cooking and back to those basic nutrients.
But I think too, you brought up a good point about, these common food groups that get demonized. And, as a naturopathic doctor, a really common thing, people want to come see us about our food sensitivities, right? And it's like, well, what about food sensitivity testing and stuff like this? And it's like, it certainly has its time and place. But again, what I've just found time and time again is that, first of all, there's other things driving that permeability, immune reactivity issue with some of these foods.
Now, you just threw out two big words there. Tell me why.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Because I want people to understand the food testing. Back up and kind of talk about that, because we did a lot of food testing initially, and I think you and I have learned over time.
Learned from that.
Sort of have modified our thinking on that. So talk about what are we really testing when we do food testing? Why is that not a food allergy? And what's really, in our clinic, we really try to drive towards what the root cause is.
Okay, so I think, what's important to understand about food sensitivity testing is that there's a lot of different ones out there, and they're arguably trying to measure a certain type of immune response, right? So the one that we most commonly use, and even still use on occasion, we're measuring these substances in our body called immunoglobulins, right? And we have these different types of immunoglobulins. So with immunoglobulin E, or IgE, for example, that's really what we're trying to use to assess like a true allergy, a true
like
allergic.
a peanut allergy.
Yeah, like where it's going to cause you to have hives or a rash, or you like anaphylactic, like you're not breathing, your throat's closing. More of what we would constitute what we sometimes call a true allergy.
Well, and most people, they come in knowing that.
Right. Yeah,
they've
you don't need a test
it.
sometimes to, confirm that for you. But then when we look at like the immunoglobulin G and immunoglobulin A, those are the two other types that we test. We know that immunoglobulin A is found in higher concentration in certain parts of the body, right? So like those mucosal types, so the lining of your gut, your sinuses, your bladder's even actually a mucosal membrane. So I think, that's where we can kind of start to differentiate a little bit, where it's like, okay, no, you're still having an immune system response. Like sometimes we can think of it too, I think, in like, what is your immune system trying to tolerate? Because, and I think that's then where the permeability piece really comes in, right? Because, despite what maybe some people believe, leaky gut, or sometimes we like to call it intestinal permeability, it's a real thing, right? Yeah. It's well documented.
That one actually is all over the medical literature. But I still hear people say, leaky gut's not a thing.
Yeah. So I think, once these substances pass through or leak through, right, the membrane, your immune system is right there on the other side, right? I mean, as a matter of fact, most of our immune activity is in the gut. And so, and it makes sense. I mean, it's one of the largest membranes that we have, exposing us to the outside world.
Yeah.
So you want your immune system there to protect you.
Well, and a lot of people don't even think about that our gut is still it's still exposed to
it's
the
still outside of your
body.
Yeah, exactly. And so when these things, and I think that's where, like you mentioned earlier, like kind of driving back to that root cause of like, well, why is that happening?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a number of reasons that increase that intestinal permeability piece, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the more common ones I think we see in our clinical practice would be high levels of stress, right?
Right. So cortisol is
probably driving a lot of that for sure. But we see a lot of dysbiosis, which essentially means, most everybody's familiar with the microbiome. It's all those trillions of microbes like bacteria and yeast or fungus, and sometimes other microbes like viruses and parasites that are in that microbiome that your immune system has to interact with too. And when there's a big time imbalance there, that can cause loads of inflammation that leads to that permeability piece. So I think that's the key, right? Like that's what we had learned along the way of like testing, identifying what the immune system was trying to tolerate with these so-called food sensitivities, right? Where you can still have an immune response to.
So when people are saying, hey, when I notice when my kids eat this food, they feel bad.
Yeah,
that may not be an allergy.
Right.
That could be that they're leaking that across into a place that's supposed to be a privileged immune space where foreign bodies aren't supposed to come.
Yeah, and that when that leaks across, that doesn't necessarily just stay at the gut, right? So we have what we call, teach people these extra intestinal symptoms. So you can eat something and totally have a headache or joint pain.
Right.
Or it doesn't just mean like, oh, I eat something and maybe I feel bloated or have diarrhea, right?
Yeah.
So I think, hopefully that gives people just a little more context of what we're really trying to assess for when we look at food sensitivity testing.
Yeah, I think that really helps people to understand, because in the past, when I first started doing that testing, I would see, oh, look, you're reacting to these foods, and we'd remove those foods, and people would feel better temporarily. So you felt like, oh, we're on the right path. Clinically, we're seeing an improvement. And then slowly you'd see regression in symptoms, and so you'd think, well, let's retest, and then you see a different variety of foods that they're reacting to, and the patients are like, well, that's everything I've switched to, and and then there were some schools that thought, well, we just need to rotate foods, and it got to the point where we're like, this is pretty tedious.
It's kind of like you're just stuck on a wheel. Right?
And then I think the understanding improved, and we started learning about zonulin and Alessio Fasano's work up at the mucosal immunology lab, and understanding that leaky gut is really the thing that's driving all these immune reactions has really been, I think, a profound change in the way we approach patients and helping them understand what food sensitivity is. But it's amazing. You can walk into Target and buy your own food sensitivity test now and do it at home.
Oh my gosh, you can buy them online.
Yeah.
But I think here's another thing early on in my practice with food sensitivity testing where I saw it sometimes develop into a problem is that, it's like, what do you do with those people who are lit up like a Christmas tree?
Yeah, what do they eat?
What do they eat?
Right.
So I think, man, if there's a big lesson I learned along the way with that is if you restrict too much, it's hard to heal. I mean, it's hard for your body to be in a healing type or repair type state if you don't have the tools to do it.
Yeah.
And obviously, like we've, been talking about so far, nutrition is one of those, just vital, absolutely necessary tools that we have to have.
Right.
So, I think
it's one of our pillars.
It's one of our pillars.
In our clinic,
For
we
sure.
have the 5 pillars that we work
Yeah.
on. In fact, this month we're focusing on food in our clinic.
In naturopathic medicine, it's a huge determinant of health.
Right.
And like there's many, I love the kind of quote where it's like food can be your greatest form of medicine, or sometimes, a big enemy, right? Or a big issue, big contributor to pain and suffering, to dysfunction.
Why do you think on those food sensitivity tests, I don't know that we've ever talked about this, but in thinking back and, when we do these measurements, they're often divided up into vegetables, seeds, fruits, nuts, and then meat. Meat sensitivities or let's call them immune reactions to be precise, they're much less common.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? What is it about meat that why don't we see more of these interactions?
I mean, I think, some of my initial thoughts would be because what we almost always tend to see is people are reacting to things that they eat frequently.
Okay. So maybe they're not eating enough meat in their
all
diet.
I was going to say, I think actually, despite what we're told of, Americans are eating too much meat, I actually think maybe they're really not. Because when we do dietary intakes and we want to see how much protein, a key building block, right?
Right.
To so many things in the
essential.
body, absolutely essential. How much of that are you taking in? A lot of times we find people are significantly deficient.
Yeah.
Right.
And what is your goal for protein intake with your patients?
Obviously, like with everything else, it's going to be super individualized. But, I think kind of a general rule of thumb, especially because we do these body composition DEXA scans in our office, that actually is a really accurate way to analyze somebody's lean muscle mass. I really kind of like this rule of thumb of like, hey, at minimum, let's make sure you're getting at least 1 gram per pound of lean muscle mass.
Right.
Because even then you'll find for a lot of people, that's probably even on the lower side of what they really need. But it's a more attainable like first step to get them moving in that direction.
Well, and you often see cited that the USDA or FDA's or CDC is recommending, and sometimes half of that.
Yeah.
But when you dive into the papers or the studies behind that, you find out that that is actually a threshold level, that underneath that you have signs of protein deficiency. Right? So saying that, being 1 gram above protein deficiency is not sufficiency.
Right.
Yeah. What are your feelings on the quality of protein?
Yeah.
If you're trying to get 1 gram per pound of lean body mass, how are you telling your patients to look for that high quality protein?
Well, I think this is really where I really have learned a lot and love Don Lehman's research, right, on protein. I mean, I even, listening to him talk, something that I feel like I even learned fairly recently from him is that our body doesn't assimilate all types of protein the same way. So, and I think this is a really important point I make with my patients on this too. Just because I might say that one form seems to be superior to another, it doesn't mean that lesser superior form is bad, right? So, so I think, if we look at the research from Don Lehman, he shows good evidence for that animal-based protein, right, being much better assimilated, which means, absorbed and utilized by the body compared to plant protein.
Yeah, so percentage-wise, if I remember right, something around 97% from an animal versus anywhere from 40 to 60% from a plant.
60% I feel like he said at best.
At best. Yeah. So, and do we think that's because the plant it's a fiber that you and I can't digest?
Right.
So that protein has to be hooked to some kind of backbone.
Right.
So if it's hooked to that fiber, we might be able to digest some part of the protein, but we're not getting the full effect of protein.
Yeah. And we're not ruminant animals, right? I mean, that was the other amazing thing I learned is that, that's why a cow, a ruminant animal, right, meaning they have that 4-compartment stomach, can actually upcycle protein from arguably a plant protein source, right? Because a cow wants to eat grass.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, that was a crazy thing to learn that they're actually, when you say upcycling, meaning they're eating a gram of protein in plant, but they're actually creating more protein, and arguably it would be their microbiome that's doing that, right? Because you could even make the case that maybe cows aren't the ones eating the grass. It's their gut, just full of microbes. That are breaking down that. That
so
fiber.
I think that's the most important, point with protein is that when we're trying to help teach our patients how to optimize their protein intake, because it's so vital to, so many things in the body, that selecting the, more optimal type and getting the biggest bang for your buck. Now, does that mean I tell patients don't eat any plant protein? No.
Right.
It's just but you have to, first of all, you have to know that and then account for it when you're trying to be intentional about how much protein you're eating, right? So it's if you're counting and trying to reach this gram number to okay, this is what my body needs. I know that if I, let's say I put a scoop of peanut butter in my protein smoothie shake that I'm making, I'm, what the label says on that peanut butter nutrition is that, 1 tablespoon is, however many grams, 6 or so grams. I'm not assimilating that full 6 grams.
You might be getting half of that. I might be getting
3,
Right.
So it's just being aware of that, which, not many people are. I mean, I wasn't totally aware of the plant difference between plant and animal.
Yeah.
So I think, that's a big take home. So to go back to your original question of why do we then rarely see people have these meat intolerances?
Yeah.
If people are buying meat, mostly in an unprocessed form, maybe there's, argument too that okay, there's not something there with the food that's making it more allergenic.
Right.
I don't know. But I mean, we certainly know that industry also has its, fair share of problems when it comes to producing meat.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk more about that because I think something that maybe even a lot of your patients don't know is that you and your husband have moved out of the city. You guys are now living out on 20 plus acres out near Valley Center.
We're naive city kids trying to be farmers.
It's been if people don't follow you on Instagram, they really need to because it's been such a delight to see all the things that you guys are experiencing. So talk a little bit about what you and your husband are trying to do. What are your goals with your own family's food? What are you learning about farming? Talk a little bit about that journey so far.
I mean, it's definitely, I feel just a key, integral part of our journey in many ways, but especially when I think about food, right? Because with this land, we're using animals to, make the land better, but also make the animal better, right? I mean, we're putting these grazing animals, we have cows, sheep, goats, seasonally we have pigs, we have chickens, those are at least the animals we have that we eat on our land. And I have to, of course, give my husband credit. He does most of that amazing work and I get to, greatly benefit from that. But gosh, in some of our, even what I would, consider obstacles at the time in the last year of just, things that have popped up unexpectedly and we maybe had to harvest an animal in a different way or sooner than what we had wanted to. I mean, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about when food is this incredibly important thing that we need to live and how so many of us are stuck in a pattern of not giving it the respect and time that it deserves. Living life this way has just so deepened this appreciation for these animals and the gift that they give us. And that to me, never in my life did I recognize, I think, how important that is to have that deep connection and appreciation for food. Because think about that with anything else. I mean, if you have this deep appreciation and connection with it, you're going to nurture that and you're going to make it important. And that does that when you're up close with that animal in that way, And I know that's not for everybody. And I'm not, even though maybe personally, I would love to see everybody do that. I know that's not for everybody.
Well, and I think, when you talk about what is ideal and what is reasonable, I mean, yes, the ideal thing would be to raise an animal from birth, to keep them on pasture all the way through, even to have a stress-free slaughter, to where that
Yeah.
animal never had to see the inside of a stock trailer,
Trailer.
wouldn't have to go to a to a
Processor.
feedlot or to a
Yes.
processor.
Yes.
That animal, even in its last moments of life, is with its family.
Yeah.
And then you're getting this stress-free product that you
Yeah.
really can't. But again, I mean, it would be great if we could all enjoy
Yeah.
meat that way.
Yeah.
I think there may be a path to that.
I think there is.
Someday.
I just don't think a lot of people, want to hear that or like that. Like,
Yeah.
I love how, Will Harris of White Oak Pastures, I think,
I could listen to his
oh
accent
my gosh,
all day
he's like
long.
so great. His accent's so great, and he talks like so like slowly and intentionally. But I just remember him saying that, look, we're not trying to feed the world. And I love that, because that's so many of these, bigger agricultural companies'
Yeah.
argument. Well, we
Yeah.
can't feed the world doing that.
Yeah, they'll say you can't
Yeah.
raise cows on pasture. You've
Yeah.
got to process them in 385 days.
Yeah.
And I do love that, because people have said that. They're like, well, how are you
Yeah.
going to feed the world that way? And
Yeah.
his response is, I'm just trying to feed my community.
Right.
And
Well,
so-
and not to be cruel, but I mean, if you look at America, I mean, yes, some people unfortunately do go hungry and go without food, but we have an obesity epidemic.
Yeah, we've
So-
definitely gone the other way.
Yeah.
I mean, the pendulum
Yeah.
has swung to the point where
Yeah.
finding calories isn't the problem.
It's not hard.
It's really
For
finding the
most.
nutrition.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I do dream of a day that, for instance, if someone wanted to buy meat that you've processed on your own land.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, right now, there's no path for that. The government
Yeah.
doesn't allow it.
Yeah. You'd have to get creative.
You'd have to get very creative to try to figure out how to do that. But I
Right.
do think it's something that, we've talked about,
Right.
these boulders in our
Right.
clinic of like seemingly immovable objects that we just work on over time.
Right.
And I think that one of trying to make food a more local phenomenon
Yeah.
is such an important one. I mean, even
Yeah.
teaching people to have backyard chickens. I mean, in
Yeah.
the city of Wichita, you can
can.
have 5 chickens as long as you don't have any roosters.
I mean, really, I was going to say, I think in Wichita at least, I think the main rule is you just can't have a rooster in
Can't
city
have a
limits.
rooster.
But in order to have eggs, you don't have to have a rooster.
Exactly.
Hens will lay
They'll
on their
lay-
own.
Yeah.
Now some argue they lay better with a rooster, but that's okay. You don't have to have one.
Right.
But even if you're like, hey, animals just aren't my thing.
Yeah.
There are so many local people like
Tons.
me
Yeah.
who are doing this that have enough to sell.
Well, shout out to Brian Alexander,
Yeah.
Red Hills Rancher. He has a saying. He says, "Shake the hand that feeds you."
Yeah.
Get to know your farmer.
Yes.
Find out where your food comes
Yes.
from. Yeah,
Yes.
I would love if we got back to a place, because I think even 2 or 3 generations ago, the majority of your food would come within 5 or 10 miles of where
Right.
you live, and now our food doesn't come within 500 miles of where we live.
Right.
In many cases, we're I think it was Will Harris, or it might have been Joel Salatin, who was sharing that we will take chickens raised in the United States, ship them over to China to be processed, put on a styrofoam tray, wrapped in cellophane, and shipped back. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense.
No.
But somebody probably figured out the economics of it and
Yeah.
said we can save 3 cents
Yeah.
per pound or whatever, and
Yeah.
then that's the way it is.
Yeah. And that's a lot of times, I mean, that's a big obstacle for people too, right? And not just in food, in lots of areas of life,
Right.
right?
The convenience.
One of my favorite quotes on convenience is that we've sacrificed our health on the altar of convenience.
Yeah.
And people do it, I think, oftentimes unknowingly.
Yeah.
They're trying to keep up, they're trying to do all the things. And I just see that as a really common obstacle in the clinic when people are struggling with their health.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, your body's not getting the nutrition it needs. And
Well, I think one way, connecting people to farmers who are raising animals differently, who are
Yeah.
trying to keep the antibiotics,
Yes.
the hormones.
Yes.
And I know there's time, if you have a sick animal, you got to treat it. But it's not the de facto standard.
Yeah.
I mean, again, Brian Alexander was sharing, like when they take these animals off of the trailers at feedlots, they sort them into a high risk and a low risk animal.
Yeah.
High risk gets this combo of medications,
Yeah.
low risk gets this combo.
Yeah.
There's no risk animal
yeah, I was
on
going to
those
say.
feedlots. They're all getting something.
They're all getting something.
But that obstacle, I mean, I think there's very easy steps you can take. Like, I think one of the biggest one is buy a large freezer,
Yeah.
right? A deep freeze
Yep.
where you can buy
Yep.
your meat in bulk from a farmer. You can buy a quarter cow.
Well, and then when you're talking about, economics, that's much more economically affordable for people when
Way
you
more
buy it
affordable.
like that.
Yeah.
But I also think too, I mean, gosh, when I think about my own family budget, the second highest line item on our budget
Is food.
is food.
Yeah.
And
don't you think we should look at food as not a cost center, but really an investment?
100%.
Right, because
100%.
none of us think twice about throwing money in our 401k,
Right.
putting in our kids'
Right.
education fund,
Right.
because we know that that's going to bear interest over time and we'll get out more than we do. Shouldn't food be seen the same way? That I'm not spending money on food, I'm investing in my own health.
Yes.
Because if you spend that money up front, you really are, think of the savings you have on the back end of now you're not paying all, the ridiculous cost of medication.
You're definitely, at least, the argument would be you're setting yourself up to have the best chance to have some of the lowest healthcare costs.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Obviously nothing makes us bulletproof.
Right.
But oh my gosh, huge investment. And that's, that's a big reason why we budget that way.
Yeah.
And it is still possible. I think maybe even this is where, thinking about I was saying I know animals aren't for everybody, raising animals aren't for everybody. Mm-hmm. It's everybody does, or at least should have a budget, right? We're all, limited to a certain extent as to what that looks like. But, I'm not going to tell somebody, well, don't eat vegetables if you can't buy organic, or don't eat vegetables if you can't buy it from a farmer.
Right.
Sure, I would love to spend time with that person and teach them how to grow their own food, because that's actually really economical.
Right.
But, again, maybe not for everybody. But like I was saying, I think, okay, you can still go to the grocery store and make the best choice that you can. Yeah. Right?
Or, think about herbs. Herbs are something that are really easy to grow indoors on a windowsill.
So cheap.
And you look at what fresh herbs cost to come in these plastic containers. Yeah. $4 or $5 for, for a couple sprigs of rosemary. Mm-hmm. That stuff grows like weeds in the garden.
Oh my gosh. You could grow 6 huge bushels of it at that cost,
Well, and so, and you have 2 girls that you're teaching them about food, and you're going to be probably teaching them how to shop for food. You still go to the grocery store. It's not like you're completely self-sufficient on your farm.
I take my girls with me to the grocery store.
So talk about some of the things you do. When you go shopping, where does Dr. Marvin go shopping? What are you looking for? How are you doing it to stay on a budget? Because I think right now everybody's struggling with the high cost of everything. Right. So, while gas is going up, food's going up, rent is going up for a lot of people. Yep. What are some ways that people can take away from this podcast the next day and say, I can start making some healthier choices? What are some of those tips that you have employed in your own family?
Well, I think you can really do it arguably at any kind of store. I can certainly share the stores where I'll go find things. I will say, I think we spend most of our grocery dollars, if we're shopping at a store like that, probably at Costco, just because they do have a decent selection of organic produce or organic products where you can buy it in bulk. We're only a family of 4, and my girls are young. They're 6 and 3. And so, it doesn't have to be Costco, but it can be really any grocery store.
And why, when you talk about organic, are there some foods where you say, hey, you maybe don't need to buy this organic? Yeah. Why are some things you really want to push your patients, our clients, towards organic, and other places where we might say,
some things are pretty obvious, right? Especially, some of these common foods that people like to, more processed common foods that people like to consume, that there is evidence that we have high glyphosate residual on, right? And glyphosate has very clearly been linked to a whole host of
you can measure
cancer.
People's urine now.
Serious stuff, right? It's not just I get a stomach ache from glyphosate. It's oh no, I could actually develop a tumor, right?
So staying away from some of the pesticides, the herbicides that are
look,
used.
I know that there are pesticides and herbicides in the organic industry. Right. So I'm not saying that the organic industry is a perfect angel either. But again, when you're trying to be a consumer in a store, it's a good place to start if you can. And that's where I find that at a place like Costco, you can get a massive bag of organic broccoli for $6. Versus a tiny little head, maybe at some other stores it's going to be more expensive.
So go home and freeze that,
so you
whatever
can
you're not
freeze
using.
It, but I think too, what people will probably realize is that if they buy that real food and just simply incorporate it into their meals, for example, last night at our house, we made burgers with actually the beef from your cow.
Oh, good.
And we didn't even get the grill out. We just used the cast iron skillet in the house. Those in the family that wanted a bun, we used sourdough that I made, right? And it wasn't even a sourdough bun. It was just sliced sourdough.
Right.
It's the same thing,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And instead of like, oh, now I've got to come up with a side, I literally just make a veggie tray.
Yeah.
I make my own dip. I make my own dressings. I make stuff like that to serve with it, but you don't have to.
Right.
But, we just basically, my veggie tray is I just cut up a bunch of carrots, broccoli. Maybe I bought sugar snap peas or whatever, or maybe whatever's growing in the garden. But any veggie that's inexpensive.
Yeah.
And you serve it alongside of it.
Yeah.
And that was dinner. And we were all fed.
Right.
We were all happy.
Yeah.
And we all felt good.
That's great.
You know what I mean? So that's how simple it can be. That's the majority of the meals we eat in our house.
Yeah.
So
when you're choosing organic foods, are there things like oranges and bananas? We don't necessarily need to get organic for that.
Yeah,
right? If it has a thick skin, or is that changing? Is that something
I did recently with bananas, and also at Costco you can get a 3-pound bunch of organic bananas for $2.
Okay, so
but I did, I read an article recently talking
sounds like
about
we need
how
Costco as a sponsor.
Yeah, I know Costco can sponsor me. That'd be great. These, and this is I think where you do kind of like you mentioned earlier, you get into this tricky situation of like bananas don't grow around here.
Right.
And so it's coming from far away.
Yeah.
And one of the costs of that is like a banana that arguably needs to ripen just right for most people to want to consume it. They're using chemicals for stuff like that. So even though you're not eating the peel,
good point.
so I think, again, I'm not trying to like fear monger or like make people just now worry about their bananas.
Right.
But I also think too, it's like when you're informed, you can make decisions.
Yeah.
And I think another thing that people don't realize is that you are voting every time you buy something at the store.
Oh, 100%.
If we don't demand better products from these companies, they're going to keep giving
junk
what best fits their bottom line.
Yeah.
And their shareholders.
Yeah.
It's not about what's best for you and me.
That is so true. If we could change the foods that we have in our grocery store by just changing what we buy. And if more people would stop buying the packaged cereals that, are again, you can measure glyphosate in a box of Cheerios. That's when it's gone through an oven. And oats aren't even a glyphosate. That's not even a modified organism that should be sprayed with glyphosate. So,
and maybe this is, maybe this is one of the ways too that I find that I can, try to connect with people, my patients, when I talk about this, because, I can be understanding a little bit that, it doesn't really work anymore to talk to people about, hey, you should eat this way because it's good for you.
Right.
Or because it's healthy.
Yeah.
It's like most people generally understand that, right? And so sometimes I find by talking about maybe some of the injustices, like this actually works really well in kids. There's even some research in like kind of that teen group.
I love your approach when you do this with kids.
It's like that, the research really shows that, especially teens, right? It's like when I was a teenager, mortality was like, what's that?
Yeah, you're not interested in offsetting diabetes or dementia later in life. You're there to rebel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean? I'm invincible. Right?
Yeah.
And so what they've even found through research, like this, there's research in this that shows like the way that you can really help young people understand this is by talking about the injustices. And that's a way to connect.
Yeah.
And so, there's arguably other ways to get people to connect to how important this is.
Right.
But that can be a big one.
Or even showing them, hey, this is how these large food corporations are trying to target your eyeballs by using cartoon characters, flashy colors. They're really wanting you to get sucked into this sale. Yeah. And once you've taught a kid to recognize that, they see it for what it is.
Right.
Like, hey,
well, and it's not
they
even,
want my money.
The scary part is that marketing's definitely one big thing. But, if you check out Michael Moss's book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, that investigative journalism piece on the industry actually hiring scientists to manipulate food to make it hit your receptors just right.
Yeah.
To make it addictive.
Yeah. What is it? It's the concept is the vanishing caloric deficit, where you can eat like a cheese puff and you can just eat and
Keep
eat and
going.
eat, and your brain just never registers that as calories.
Why are there these certain foods that after you've arguably sat down to a full meal
that you can still eat?
Always find room for?
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's fascinating.
And so again, it's like, gosh, when you teach people the injustice of that system of
Right.
like, these people don't care about your well-being. They
Yep.
care about your money.
Yeah.
And so, I think there's definitely another industry we don't have to get into, the healthcare industry or the insurance industry, where it's like that kind of stuff. It makes me angry. Like, I don't want to give those people my money. And you do that when you shop for food at the store.
Yeah.
So, it's something to think about. And like I said, sometimes it helps people resonate or connect a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, and I think we also try to educate our patients about, trying not to buy food that's, in plastics.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I've seen you literally jump across our break room kitchen and almost strangle somebody who's about to microwave in plastic. So there's things even around our food that we could probably
I care
improve.
about
You care
them.
about them.
But
yeah.
I probably could tone my response a little bit instead
So
of
even if it's microwave safe plastic, you
yeah,
would say
no heating any
don't
kind of
heat that in
plastic.
plastic.
Even if you're not heating your food up in plastic,
Yeah.
it's like if you're putting hot food onto plastic.
Right.
So this is where, fast food, when you're getting fast food and it's going onto these wrappers that can, and the reason these things have these chemicals, it's so that the juices and the liquids don't leach out all over everything.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know, but the Starbucks cup that's made of cardboard
Yes.
is lined in plastic.
Yes.
Actually makes the cup so they can't recycle it.
Ugh.
And so that's a
Yes.
hot liquid most of the
Yes.
time.
Yes.
So avoiding plastic where we can.
Yes. Yeah. Which I understand. It's almost impossible.
Well, yeah. I mean,
know?
if you tried to say I'm not going to eat any food that has touched plastic. I mean, even when we processed our cow, like that was the only option was to we use plastic wrap.
Right.
I think
Right.
we're starting to find that people are doing biopsies of human fat and actually seeing that there's microplastics in humans now. And of course, I think there's this push to remove plastic from our food supply, but unfortunately, I think the push is in the wrong area. I was at a grocery store in Colorado, and I get to the front in the checkout, and they said, "Do you have a bag?" And I know, no, I'll just take a plastic one. And they go, "We can't give you a plastic bag." And I looked on the conveyor belt, and I'm like, the apples are in plastic, the grapes are in plastic, the steak is covered in plastic, and I'm like,
what?
what? If you're really trying to reduce plastic, I mean,
Yeah.
we need to change more than just the plastic
Yeah.
bag we carry it out in.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think another important piece, when I want to encourage and talk to families, especially parents with young kids.
Yeah.
It's so hard,
It's a
right?
struggle.
It's a struggle. I mean, we homeschool our children, and it's something that, we intentionally choose for many different reasons.
Right.
And I understand, again, that's not for everybody.
Exactly.
And so, one obstacle with kids is but the food at school and school lunch.
Yeah.
But I really think it's one of our probably, if not the most important job as a parent,
Right.
is to teach your child.
Yeah.
You are their teacher.
Well, it's the best inheritance you can give them is the sense of
Yes.
understanding a healthy relationship with food,
Yes.
how to prepare their own
Yes.
food.
Yes.
They don't need the school lunch, right? You could make more food at dinner, package in a glass container,
Or
send them.
even if they do eat the school lunch,
Yeah.
it's let's teach them, what, all these things, right? Of the benefits of food and what
Yeah.
food is and,
Right.
How food also makes you feel.
Don't go to the
Like,
vending machine.
Teach them that. Teach them to learn those connections for themselves, right?
Yeah.
So that they develop that confidence and self-trust, that they can make those decisions on their own. And are they going to get it perfect? No. Do we get it perfect as adults? No.
No.
But I think, that's how to try to create and teach this healthy relationship. So that's what we do with our kids. We're
Yeah.
just constantly, not constantly, but any mealtime or, when we go to birthday parties, it's yes, my kids eat the cake and ice cream.
Right.
But you better believe that if they're complaining about a symptom or something later on,
You're going to tie it
we're
back to that.
gonna potentially teach and make connections so that they can learn that, right? And same thing like I mentioned earlier of again, I'm a parent of a 6 and 3-year-old.
Yes.
They are not perfect behaved little angels when I take them out into public.
Right.
But I take them out into public
Yeah.
because how else will they
How else are they
learn
gonna know?
to be a functioning adult in society
Right.
if they don't get to experience that? So, and yes, we have had screaming kicking on the floor meltdowns in public. I'll never forget once at Walmart, we're in the self-checkout, and of course, the god-awful things they have at the self-checkout, right? Or just at checkout in general.
Yeah, right.
And I want this,
Yep.
and no, sorry, we're not getting that. And the loudest scream, all of Walmart gets quiet.
Oh, man.
And so it's like,
the
but that's
worst.
life.
Yeah.
Like, let's experience life
Right.
and get through and learn how to navigate the hard stuff.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're just not teaching our kids how to then do
Yeah.
this, like nutrition, like how to eat well,
Right.
Well,
so we always talk about what are the things we can take away.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you want your patients when they come in and they just feel like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed. I've got to go raise a cow.
Yeah.
I'm going to be milking my own goat. I've got to
gonna
grow
be like,
my own
you can
food.
do it. No.
That is, I mean, I had a patient today who just was like, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah,
and
I'm
I was
just
like,
not
okay,
gonna do
well,
that.
here's some simple steps. What are some very simple things that people can do when they first come and they have not heard any of this, that they can go away and they can say, we don't want them to go home and just throw out everything in their pantry.
Sure, yeah.
But what are some simple things that you want people to start doing to apply these principles?
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to that concept of like, just keep it simple. It does not, we do not need to be making these elaborate meals, keep the ingredients simple. Like I said, I mean, we had just chopped fresh veggies as a side to our burgers last night. It's not like I had to make baked beans and potato salad and chips and, stuff like that. And so it's like, just look at stuff as like, because I bet everybody has stuff in their pantry at home already where it's like, can I eat some protein? Is there a vegetable here? And just keep it simple to where, like I said, even like last night, we didn't even have to cook the side. We literally just served it, and even in today's world, you can buy those things already chopped up for you even.
Right.
So it's like, okay, well, when you're shopping, choose the things that if you feel like that, chopping vegetables is overwhelming for you, well, buy it already chopped.
Yeah.
So then you just literally pull it out and put it out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I could get into what would technically be some probably more elaborate things.
Right.
But I think if you're just, like you said earlier, shop the perimeter.
Right.
Don't buy, I love how you say often in the clinic, you're like, don't buy it if it comes in a box or a bag or or a drive-through window.
Right. Box, bag, can, over the counter, or through a window.
Yeah.
And then the other one we talk about is if there's more than 5 ingredients on the label, we tell people that might not be food, right?
Or like, can you even pronounce the word on the label?
Yeah.
Do you even know what it is? Like, you should recognize
those things. And if those are ingredients that you're,
Yeah.
you look at the ingredients and you're like, I don't even know what that ingredient is, or you don't have that ingredient at home, like guar gum.
Right.
How many people have guar gum in their pantry right now?
Not me.
There's tons of stuff that's filled with guar
with
gum and
gums.
carrageenans, and it's like, I don't even know where carrageenan comes from. I think it's
Or like pasta.
seaweed, maybe.
Like, I mean, even if we go back to some of these like commonly demonized food,
Yeah.
pasta, dairy,
Right.
oh my gosh, I could get into dairy.
Yeah.
But like pasta, for example, we eat spaghetti at our house.
Yeah.
I'll make spaghetti. At least right now, I don't make my own pasta. Maybe one day I will, because I just love to make, that's my artistic outlet,
Right.
is what I prepare and make in the kitchen.
Yeah.
But for the overwhelming majority of us, you're going to buy pasta that's already made if you're going to have something like spaghetti. But what a lot of people don't realize is that if you go to the store, like the typical grocery store, like in Wichita would be Dillon's, right? And you look at this wall of pasta products.
Yeah.
And if you start looking at labels, it's not just flour.
Right.
It's flour and these fortified synthetic junky vitamins like folic acid and things like that, where there's some evidence where that causes some harm for people. And potentially other preservatives. And it's like, no, when you buy something like pasta, it should just say 100% ideally organic semolina wheat, for example. That should be the only thing on the ingredient label.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I can spell that, I can pronounce it,
Yeah.
and I know what it is.
Yeah.
Right? Even with pasta sauces. It's
Yeah.
like, yes, we can talk about how you can make it yourself, but you look at the label and it's got sugar and high fructose corn syrup and all kinds of junk in it.
Yeah.
Look for one that's just tomatoes, spices, vinegar, stuff like that.
So again, just keep it simple.
Just keep it simple.
Yeah.
Keep it simple.
Well, and I think sometimes people do get to the point where they feel crippled about their food choices. Like you mentioned, these patients who their entire panel shows they're reacting to everything.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be careful with those because we can create this almost an anxiety around food.
Yes, a deficit.
Yep.
Deficiencies, and then like we said earlier, it's almost impossible to heal when your body's in a state like that.
Yeah.
And I think here's another thing I'll just throw out there, because I think especially parents of young kids, it's like, but kids want snacks. Do
kids need a snack every 2 hours?
No.
No?
Well, I can be a very literal person, as my husband will attest.
Right.
But when you say snack, you imply like a certain type of food, right?
Yeah.
And and of course, when kids say snack, they imply a certain type of food,
A
right?
Rice Krispie bar.
Oh, yeah. I want a packaged little container of little, Cheez-Its or Goldfish or gummy bears or fruit snacks.
Fruit snacks, right.
And no, kids don't need that. And I was in a place, over the past few years with kids where I would seek out these arguably like organic, maybe, in my mind justify like a minimally processed type of a healthy snack. And I just realized it was a huge obstacle for my kids to eating like the real food that we would be trying to serve more at mealtime.
Yeah.
And so I just gradually phased it out. And of course, you get complaints here and there, but again, that's okay. Like our job as parents is to teach our kids
to steer them in the right direction.
You can eat these things.
Yeah.
So if my kids are eating a snack at home, they're grabbing
string cheese,
the veggies, a slice of cheese, an apple,
right.
A
slice of salami,
a glass of milk, milk or dairy. That's the other, demonized group, right?
Yeah.
And where it's like, we of course, drink raw milk, and again,
and you're still alive.
And we're still alive. We haven't died of some horrible intestinal infection or anything. But again, even just with like the concept of raw milk, which we could do like an entire podcast on, by the way, just on itself, but it still goes back to that. It's in its unprocessed form.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. It's simple.
Simple.
Yeah.
Simple.
Well, and I think, we could spend a lot of time on milk, and maybe we should have some of our dairy farmers on the podcast to talk about.
Follow-up.
Yeah. I think that would be really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I with kids, it's tough. I mean, one of the things I think, I've heard parents say that they'll designate a drawer in their refrigerator for snack food, and what they do is they put in some of those simple, snack meats, little tiny carrots, which is so funny. I learned that those little tiny carrots are actually big carrots that were too ugly to sell, and they just throw them in a machine that shaves off the rough edges, and then they sell them for more than the fancy carrots were. But their kids just know, like, oh, I get to go get a snack, and they open up the drawer and they're grabbing. Yeah. Even if it's like an organic applesauce, that's going to be better than most of the
We technically still have a drawer in our house, but that drawer, like it's not a refrigerator drawer because we just have the food that we have in our fridge. But in our drawer, right now there's a bag of pistachios. Yeah. And there's some beef sticks in there. Right. So it's like that, somebody could still argue maybe that's still kind of somewhat of a snack, but it's like real food. Yeah. Simple, real, unprocessed food.
Yeah.
So
we've talked about how to teach kids to eat healthy, food intolerances. What are some other things that you feel like are important to share with our patients when it comes to food? The other challenges that, maybe, we treat a lot of autoimmune disease in the clinic. What are some things that how do you try to help those patients?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, honestly,
I know that's a huge.
It's a big
topic.
We could go a lot of directions with that. But if I'm just, if I'm just thinking about more of the nutritional aspect, it kind of ties into even what we were talking a little bit earlier about the immune system and like the food sensitivities, right? Yeah. It's like what we're identifying with these tests is like what your immune system is trying to tolerate or respond to. Yeah. And that's, a key component with autoimmunity, right? I think, one of the beautiful things about the way that we practice medicine is really, at the end of the day, trying to teach our patients, like, here's what your body's really trying to say. Right. And actually, a big theme in my practice, at least right now, is because I understandably get people who come in and they're just so frustrated and they're suffering from symptoms that they have. And they're like, why is my body doing this to me? And it's like, what I try to teach them is that, your body only has these ways to communicate with you. Yeah. It can't communicate the way you and I sit here and talk to each other. Right. Right. So, your body's on your team.
Yeah.
This is your body's only way to try to tell you like something's wrong and I need your help. Right.
Yeah.
And so,
There's adaptive responses that our body has.
So I think
to
autoimmunity
threats.
is that to a T.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, some people take that approach of like, oh, my immune system is attacking me. But oftentimes what we find is that the immune system is just appropriately responding to something.
Doing what it was designed to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so when we go back to then like these things that are added to foods, chemicals, preservatives, foreign artificial substances, your immune system is like,
what's that?
What's this?
Right. Especially if you've got that abnormal permeability.
Yes.
The leaky gut.
Yes. 100%. So while I would say, like, if we think about a therapeutic diet, like AIP or autoimmune paleo, that's certainly one that I think has a time and a place.
Yeah.
And, if you think about the core concepts of that dietary strategy, it's really keep taking it back to simplicity.
Sure.
Right? Because you're arguably trying to avoid those things that are foreign and that your immune system is like, hey, we have to try to get your attention because this shouldn't be here.
Yeah.
And then try to help that, gut piece be less permeable. And of course, when you think about the foods that you emphasize in AIP, they're all very nutritionally dense foods.
Yeah.
So while some still view it as a very restrictive diet, it's a very nourishing diet when you do it correctly.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, I see AIP as not necessarily, I know there's a lot of restrictions on AIP, but I also see that the AIP diet is really about just learning a different way of eating. And, and I think, a lot of people kind of latch onto these fad diets that we've seen. I mean, we have, patients who are vegan, we have patients who are vegetarian. I think we had one patient who came in who was a fruitarian.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And
carnivore.
We've got
paleo.
Patients doing carnivore, we've got paleo, we've got keto. So, which is the right diet?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we hear that a lot.
Yeah.
And what's the diet which fad should I be following?
Yeah. I think we got to get away from fads.
Yeah.
We just got to, again, we tend to overcomplicate things.
Yeah.
Right? We put these rules on things. And that's where the way my brain works is just kind of like, well, we don't have to do it that way.
Yeah. Back up and kind of see
what does the body really need?
Right.
And yes, I know that all those, I don't even have to call them fad diets, but all those diets, I know there's lots of people out there that do some of those and they thrive on it.
Yeah.
And that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. But where I think we get into trouble is when we then paint with a broad brush and think that, if these people did great, then everybody should do great on it.
Well, yeah, like somebody who has leaky gut, if they did the carnivore diet, again, that's one that the food sensitivities are pretty low, so it's not going to challenge their immune system as much. Maybe there's, more glutamate in that diet, so they're getting more healing in the gut. But that doesn't mean that they can't eventually reintroduce some of those foods.
Yeah.
I mean, therapeutically, carnivore may be really effective for resetting things that have gone wrong.
Right. What I think, unfortunately, some of these fad diets have even done for people is they question themselves, right?
Yeah.
Because they're like, well, it's like when I eat this way, I really don't feel good.
Yeah.
But so many people do so well on it.
Right.
And we destroy this like self-trust and confidence that people need to have.
The individualism.
So so sometimes I'm just like, yes, these things exist. Yes, maybe there's even good argument for trying them. But I try to get people away from this like hard and fast rule just because low FODMAP diet, for example, makes a lot of people who have small intestine bacterial overgrowth, their symptoms go away. Doesn't mean that's...
Does it fix the problem?
Yeah, it doesn't fix the problem or doesn't mean
so
that
it might
that's...
actually be masking what's at the root cause of that.
So really trying to get back to like helping people learn to develop that, intuition and self-trust, right? Of like what works for me as an individual.
Yeah.
And I really do believe that the foundation for that can be simple, real food.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I think you brought an important component of that too, is also recognizing how your body's communicating with you. Learn to be, more intuitive with your eating and understanding, it could be the stress, it could be the lack of sleep that you're getting. It could be the fact that you're not exercising. It could be the fact that your elimination's not working. You're only having a bowel movement once a week. It's going to be pretty tough to focus on your diet when you're not actually, you don't have the elimination down.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's, I think there's a lot, what I love about the functional medicine mindset and the naturopathic mindset of approaching these problems is that we have a really large toolbox of things we can use. And it is, every individual is their own individual. I mean, it's right. There is no protocol that is going to work for everybody.
Right. Right.
And so it really is getting to know that person, taking that individualized approach, understanding what their issues are, helping them come up with a plan that's going to work for them, because what might work for them is not going to work for somebody else.
Exactly.
So that individual approach and keeping it simple, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
Well, gosh, we've been talking now for a long time.
Have we? Feels
I think we went over an hour already. So one of the things, we're going to be doing this podcast more. I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk about food. And I want to encourage our patients to share these podcasts with people. We have the newsletter that we're now sending out. So if any patients feel like that might be helpful for somebody else they know, send that to your friends and family. Follow Dr. Marvin on Instagram. Do you know your tag on Instagram?
Yes, it's at Dr. Marvin ND. And there are some like underscores. It's like at Dr._Marvin_ND.
ND.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And there's some amazing
little
content
farm
on
life,
there. Little farm
sometimes
life.
a little naturopathic medicine sprinkled in. But,
yeah.
But if I'm being honest, I have more fun posting about the farm.
It's been fun to watch what you guys are doing, and shout out to Tim, your husband. I think he does an amazing job. He has jumped in with both feet. He's learning stuff at a blistering pace. It feels like, and it's been really fun to watch you guys.
Thank you.
And to watch your girls thrive in that environment has been really, really cool.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of
fun. Good. So. Thank you very much for being on the second episode of the PHW Podcast. And we're looking forward to having many, many more conversations with you.
Awesome. Thanks.